Thank you. It's good to be with you all today. I apologize for running a little bit late. I was in a different headspace and thought I was starting at 9 rather than 8:50. So I do hope to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. But I'm going to give a presentation today about the place of statecraft, especially Christian statecraft, in what I call early Christendom, and that is the period just beginning with Constantine in the 4th century, and then reflecting a little bit about where that came from and where that led over the course of time, maybe even getting us to think a little bit about all the way up until the present time. So let me just write a couple of terms on the board here really quickly. And I'll fill that in a bit as we go forward. The title is Christian Statecraft, East and West, Two Visions of a Transformed Cosmos. What I'd like to do by way of introduction is describe a little bit what I think Christianity did for the cosmos, Greek word for world, of course, what kind of cosmology Christianity introduced into the world, even before there was such a thing as Christian statecraft. Of course, Constantine converts to Christianity about the year 312. Historians disagree about when exactly his conversion was solid and heartfelt, but certainly by 313, after the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, where in that battle, or before that battle, Constantine is said to have had a conversion experience involving the cross or the Chi-Rho sign and a message, by this sign you will conquer. Then successful in his battle against Maxentius at Rome that day in 312, Constantine becomes the unchallenged ruler of Rome and eventually defeats all remaining enemies and is emperor of Rome. So that's the beginning of Constantine's reign as a Christian ruler. As I say, some people point to the fact that he was not baptized until the end of his reign to suggest that he wasn't really firmly a Christian yet. That's a debatable thing, doesn't really affect us too much today, though. Before this happened in the 4th century, however, long before this happened in the 4th century, Christianity introduced into the world a cosmology, a rather distinct cosmology, a rather distinct understanding of what the world is and how the Christian should relate to the world. This cosmology I locate in Pentecost itself and what followed Pentecost. Pentecost, that is to say the first event or day in church history, about the year 333, Pentecost brought to fulfillment the incarnation by which God became man. In Jesus Christ, divinity was joined permanently with humanity. That's what the incarnation is. The incarnation as a doctrine in traditional Christianity, both East and West, is very firmly at the center of traditional Christianity, very firmly at the center of it. And this doctrine of the incarnation brought about to Christians from Pentecost forward an understanding that the world was not void of God's presence, that there was an abiding presence of God in this world through Jesus Christ, who, ascending into heaven, sent the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, and from that point forward was mystically present as the head of the church, especially when the church assembled liturgically and sacramentally around the body and blood of Christ. So all of this is traditional Christianity, and it has a lot to do with the understanding of the incarnation. But because of this, then, from the start, from the beginning, there was a distinct cosmology that the church, as the body of Christ, whose head, Jesus Christ, in heaven is also mystically present here on earth by the Holy Spirit, that the body of Christ, the church, is bringing about a transformation of the world, a transformation of the cosmos. And this transformation, I like to call a transformational imperative, from the beginning, from Pentecost forward. That transformational imperative was sacramental. It was grounded in the sacramental life of the early church when she assembled together on the Lord's Day, as she began to elaborate the cycle of annual celebrations of Christ's ministry, as she began to develop liturgy and things like this. Of course, this really takes off after the 4th century conversion of the state, but it's already underway before that time happened. As a matter of fact, we can look at early documents from the 2nd century, within a century of Pentecost. Justin Martyr, for instance, writing his Apology, talks about what Christians do on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, how they assemble together, how they are an exclusive community. Not everyone not anyone is able to participate fully in this assembly, how there's certain things done in the liturgical assembly of Christians, and how ultimately this culminates in the experience of communion with Christ by the consumption of the Eucharist. This is all going on very early on. Another early writer from this very period writes a work called Letter to Diognetus, which talks about the Christian's place in this world. And it's very in line with the New Testament. With Hebrews, for instance, it says, a Christian in this world has no permanent home, or polis. That's the word used in the Greek. No permanent city, no permanent abiding city, but looks for the city to come, looks for the kingdom of heaven, is a sojourner in this world, has no total attachment to anything in this world. But nevertheless, the letter to Diognetus says, the Christian interacts with the world, brings sanctity to the world, interacts with people in this world, confronts things in this world that are not right, such as abortion is mentioned there, and other things as well, and infanticide. And the Christian, therefore, is constantly engaged in this cosmos, transforming the cosmos by his presence, her presence within the cosmos. So from the start, then, we have this transformational imperative. Transformational imperative. It's perhaps summarized best of all in the New Testament itself, when Paul, speaking in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not be conformed to this cosmos, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, in Greek, nous, from which the adjective noetic comes. A big, important word in Eastern Christian vocabulary is nous, the inner person, the person transformed by baptism, living life for the kingdom of heaven and not this age, not this world. So Romans chapter 12, verse 2 kind of summarizes this transformational imperative that was at work from the beginning, from Pentecost forward, but which today I'd like to bring attention to its impact on 4th century understandings or visions of statecraft and the transformed cosmos. So to understand how this happens, to understand how Christians then came to redefine and re-experience and reinvigorate government, statecraft, when the government was finally open to Christianity's influence, we need to have an understanding of what the Christian concept of the state and the larger world was. What I argue is that Christianity, from the very beginning, put forward what can be called a concept of a civilization called Christendom, with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world. That's how I define Christendom. Now, the word Christendom has been used widely by different historians and legitimately in other kinds of ways. But for me, Christendom is there from the beginning, from Pentecost. Christendom is that what we could call proto-civilization with its own subculture that directed its members, the members of the early church living through those first centuries before Constantine came along, who were directed by it to seek the heavenly transformation of the world. That is to say, the transformation of the cosmos according to the pattern that heaven offered, that the kingdom of heaven revealed by the Gospels, revealed in the life of the church, revealed in the liturgy, documented by Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. That very pattern was lived out and became the model for transformation among Christians before the 4th century. So Christendom then is a term that we can use effectively in this sense from the very beginning. Some historians speak of Christendom as like the state, like the Christian state. Some historians, for instance, talk about the origin of Christendom as the 4th century conversion of Constantine. Before that, no Christendom. We can use the word differently. I use it differently than that. And I think Christendom is a useful term for people thinking about where the world is today, even in the 21st century, and understand the place of the state, as well as the larger cosmos, in a much longer-term concept of Western civilization, not something rooted to and limited to the existence or non-existence of a formally self-consciously Christian state, such as Constantine's or Henry VIII's or the Puritans of New England or something like that. Christendom is a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of this world, as we saw with Romans 12:2. There are two Christian writers of the 4th century who engage Christendom this way. They don't use the term. It would be invented much later. But they both were interested in this transformational imperative, in the transformation of the world. And I'd like to talk about them in light of what happened when, finally, the state converted to Christianity in the Roman Empire. As I say, in the 4th century, Constantine, who became emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity. As a matter of fact, he did this, I think, just before he became emperor of Rome. And most famously, perhaps of all, in 313, a year after that Battle of Milvian Bridge, when he saw the sign and all that stuff happened, in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan, as you, I hope, know, but if you don't, I'll just mention it. The Edict of Milan was an edict that granted to Christians freedom of religion. They could no longer be molested, no longer be persecuted, no longer be martyred in the Roman Empire ruled by this Christian emperor, but they had to be tolerated. And with time, by the end of this very 4th century, Constantine's successor, not immediate, but later in the century, Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, passes legislation that makes Christianity the only legal and approved religion in the Roman Empire. I mean, talk about a breathtaking transformation of government, something hard to imagine. I was talking yesterday with Johnny Birdka about how this, maybe we can kind of understand this if we think about what it was like to live through the 1980s and early 90s, when suddenly communism, which was for the American state the great enemy, the great, challenge to liberal democracy and things like this, seemed like it was never going to go away. But after 74 years of existence, just simply disintegrated overnight almost overnight, just gone suddenly. So it's probably something like that the Christians who had endured persecution, even as late as the Diocletian persecution of the early 4th century, suddenly found themselves with a state, a government that accepted them, that protected them. And this was the historical context for this particular writer of the two that I'm talking about right now. And his name is Eusebius, Eusebius of Caesarea, not to be confused with Eusebius of Nicomedia, a different contemporary Eusebius. Eusebius of Caesarea became a bishop of the church who was primarily a scholar. He had endured a lot of the hardships of Christians living in the late 200s, and he observed everything that was going on, and he felt like it was very important to document this, to document the story of the church. And so he wrote the first a major history of the church, ecclesiastical history. He's sometimes called the father of Christian historiography. I think the Apostle Luke is. He wrote the book of Acts, after all, and the book of Acts is a work of history. I'm an historian, so I can say that. It's a great work. If you read Acts, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. The author, uses his intelligence, his creativity, guided by the Holy Spirit, to tell a story that begins, I'm talking about book of Acts now, not Eusebius, begins in Jerusalem, around the ministry of St. Peter, whose ministry is primarily directed to the Jews of Jerusalem and beyond. About midpoint, Paul enters the story, and as it were, takes the evangelical or missionary torch from Peter, and the author now focuses in the second half of the book of Acts on Paul's ministry, not to the Jews in Jerusalem, but to the Gentiles, and finally ends in Rome. From Jerusalem to Rome, from this small little place, the capital of Judaism, to the big place, Rome, which is the capital of the known ecumeny, or universe, world. And so that's a very intelligent, very interesting, creative effort to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. So that's the first church history. But Eusebius came along, and he wanted to document the whole history of the church. And for him, when he started writing it, it was the history of persecution, of enduring horrible persecution, up through the late 200s into the early 300s, when the great persecution of Diocletian was underway, killing thousands of Christians. And then, suddenly, Eusebius gets word that the emperor, the new emperor, Constantine, is a convert to Christianity, and is protecting, after 313 in the Edict of Milan, protecting it. So the historical context, then, a lot of what our discussions in these days are about politics, but we always want to remember that politics has to be placed in its context historically, that political life of human beings always has a historical context. The historical context for this radical political shift under Eusebius really shaped his view of things, And he then wrote about Constantine. He wrote really the first major life or biography of Emperor Constantine. Eusebius is sometimes criticized as being too pro-Constantine. As a matter of fact, I'll quote in a moment an oration he gave on the 30th anniversary of Constantine's rise to power. Constantine began his reign in 306. It wasn't until later that he became unrivaled emperor, as I've described, but in 306, so 30 years later in 336, I think I got the date wrong here. I think it's 9 right there when he dies. Eusebius writes at the end of Constantine's life an oration just on his 30th anniversary, just before Constantine dies in 337. He writes an oration praising Constantine. So he's seen sometimes as kind of a flunky, kind of a court bishop, something like this, whose kind of identity and kind of ministry was centered around praising Constantine and supporting him as a Christian emperor. I don't really sympathize with that view of things. One historian has documented only 4 occasions when Eusebius was in the presence of Constantine. Eusebius of Nicomedia that I mentioned earlier, he was more of the flunky, more dedicated to Constantine's power than others. Eusebius of Caesarea here, though, who wrote the church history and this oration I've mentioned, he was not really like that. He was much more objective in his thinking. His thinking, in addition to having the historical context of the amazing transformation of the state from a pagan to a Christian one, his thinking was also shaped, his vision was shaped by the very Eastern concept of a union of heaven and earth that was very much alive in Eastern Christianity. And I want to emphasize this point as well, in addition to his historical context and the politics of Constantine's conversion. Eusebius was a Greek-speaking scholar. He was in the Greek East of this time, and he was influenced by the dubious but very influential Origen. Origen was a 3rd century scholar and theologian. I think you probably heard of Origen before. Origen had a tremendous impact on early Christian theology. He lived in Alexandria, Egypt, which was the center of Christian theology at this time. He was brilliant. He did. We won't get into Origen, but he did so much to shape the kind of spirit of early Christian theology in the East. And Origen was very influenced by Plato and Platonism, Neoplatonism. He had a real sense of how heaven, in almost a Platonic sense, was the image, the ideal by which the world should live. The cosmos should govern itself. He said many things that were very influential in the development of theology in the Greek East. He was eventually condemned for some heretical teachings he also introduced. So he's a very, as I say, dubious presence or figure in early Christianity, but a very brilliant and influential one as well. Eusebius was under his influence to some extent, indirectly. And so when Eusebius writes his oration that I want to quote to you now about Christian statecraft and the place of the ruler, Constantine, in it, he was influenced by this very optimistic spirit that was found in Origen, that because of the incarnation, we're going back to that central doctrine now, because of the incarnation, the human being now participates in a very real but mystical way in the life of heaven, that heaven shapes how the Christian, even in this life, even now, experiences the world, the cosmos, a very optimistic and affirmative one. This spirit, not limited to Origen, but really found throughout the Greek East in its early cosmology, would look to passages in John's Gospel, which not only speak of the world as something that is opposed to Christ, opposed to his disciples, opposed to Christianity and the kingdom of heaven. Think, for instance, of chapter 15 of John's Gospel, where Jesus says to his disciples, "The world has hated me, and so the world will also hate you. You are not of this world, this cosmos." That's what Jesus says in John 15. But the same Jesus in John 3:16 famously is associated with the statement, God so loved the cosmos. God so loved the world that he gave to it his only begotten Son. And if the Christian is to be like God, the Christian then has to love the world. That on the surface seems to contradict something James says in one of his epistles. Fellowship with the world is enmity with God. That it's a paraphrase of it. But that's nevertheless the Gospel of John. There's two concepts of the cosmos there that both find their way into traditional Christian cosmology in the Greek East. And so what we see here is under the influence of this Origen optimism and affirmation of the cosmos, Eusebius, living through the transformation of the state, spoke then about how how Constantine contributed to the transformational imperative, the transformation of the cosmos. Let me just quote a little bit of this famous oration to you. The opening gives you a sense of what it was like. Now, some think it's an oration to Constantine on the 30th anniversary of his accession to power. Some people take it literally as something he spoke. But seeing as it's so long, there's no way he could have just sat there or stood there before Constantine in his court and spoke this long. Even Constantine, who seems to have had a pretty big ego, would not have been able to tolerate that. So I think this is probably just written down and then presented as an oration, even though it wasn't actually that. Maybe originally the core of it was the oration, and then he expanded it. But this is how he opens it. Today, Eusebius says, is the festival of our great emperor, and we, his children, rejoice therein, feeling the inspiration of our sacred theme. He who presides over our solemnity is the great sovereign himself. Now, in this translation, great and sovereign are both capitalized, so you can see, you can't really hear it, you can see that he's now transitioning from the emperor, maybe standing in his presence, and, right, the emperor up in heaven, Jesus Christ, the emperor, right? So, is the great sovereign himself, he, I mean, who is truly great, of whom I affirm, nor will the sovereign, Constantine standing next to me, who hears me be offended, but will rather approve of this ascription of praise to God, that he, capital H, capital E in this translation, is above and beyond all created things, the highest, the greatest, the most mighty one, whose throne is the arch of heaven, and the earth the footstool of his feet. So right from the start then, Eusebius, in his vision of Christian statecraft, specific, of course, in this case to Constantine, but we can draw a broader conclusion from it. From the very beginning, Eusebius looks to heaven, looks to Christ reigning in heaven as the model, as the ultimate revelation for any particular ruler in this world who claims to be a Christian, even Constantine himself. And then Eusebius continues to talk about cosmology. He does so by referring to all sorts of natural processes in the material world. But this is part of the cosmos. This is part of the creation over which Emperor Constantine, in addition to the human part of the world, reigns. And so we can see the real cosmology, the real cosmologically transformative vision of Eusebius here. So let me quote another passage to you from this oration. Does not the universal frame of earth acknowledge him, her Lord, and declare by the vegetable and animal life which she produces her subjection to the will of a superior power, namely Christ? The rivers flowing with abundant stream and the perennial fountains, listen to the poetry here. There's a real element, emphasis on beauty, on the delightful beauty of the natural world here in this transformed cosmos. The rivers flowing with abundant stream and the perennial fountains springing from hidden and exhaustless depths, ascribe to him the cause of their marvelous source. The mighty waters of the sea enclosed in chambers of unfathomable depth, and the swelling surges which lift themselves on high, and menace as it were the earth itself, shrink back when they approach the shore, checked by the power of his divine law. The dewy measured fall of winter's rain, the rolling thunder, the lightning's flash, the eddying currents of the winds, and the airy courses of the clouds, all reveal his presence to those to whom his person is invisible. So Christ, God, is present in his cosmos, even though he's invisible. We see in the majesty, the beauty of the cosmos, we see the presence of God in all of this. Even more so when we come to that part of the cosmos which is political. After all, the cosmos is not just a material order, it's also a social and political order. And so the state is also part of the cosmos. And if the cosmos has been transformed by the incarnation, if the cosmos has been transformed by the incarnation, if Christ, who is both God and man, has made himself present in the cosmos, so then also the state, like society, like the family, like any other social or a part of the cosmos, should be transformed by that presence. And that's exactly what Eusebius is arguing in this passage here. He goes on to claim then that there should be a union between heaven and earth insofar as the incarnation has transformed the earth and made it now united to heaven. Let me read to you another section. None of these is really like straightforward in demonstrating this we could call it the Eusebian vision of Christian statecraft, but this will help us also kind of pull this together, this next section from Eusebius's oration. As soon then as the supreme sovereign, God, has thus connected his own eternity by these cords of wisdom with the annual circle, he committed it to the guidance of a mighty governor, Christ, the Son of God, even his only begotten Word, to whom as the preserver of all creation, he yielded the reins of universal power. And he receiving this inheritance as from a beneficent Father, and uniting all things, both above and beneath the circumference of heaven, in one harmonious whole. Key phrase, one harmonious whole. Heaven above, earth below, now participate in one harmonious whole in Christ, who is both God and man because of the incarnation, directs their uniform course, providing with perfect justice whatever is expedient for his rational creatures on the earth, appointing its allotted limits to human life, and granting to all alike permission to anticipate even here, key phrase, even here, the commencement of a future existence. For he has taught them that beyond this present world there is a divine and blessed state of being, reserved for those who have been supported here by the hope of heavenly things, and that those who have lived a virtuous and godly life will remove hence to a far better habitation. So the hope of the kingdom of heaven, of eternal life, is even here in this life to be realized, in the presence of the God who has united heaven and earth together through the incarnation. This, we could say, is the Eusebian vision of Christian statecraft. Constantine and other Christian emperors like Constantine are expected to live out the Christian faith and its transformational imperative, that heaven should transform the world. The world should be transformed according to the model or example of heaven, entering into this world sacramentally through the life of the church, from Pentecost forward, and now in the 4th century, finding its kind of realization when the state itself becomes part of that cosmos. This is, as I say, what we could call a Eusebian vision. It's very optimistic. It looks back toward, even though Eusebius doesn't mention him, it looks back toward the influence of Origen, himself not a canonized theologian of the early church, but one who had a tremendous impact on a lot of later theologians. I think here of the Greek fathers that were influenced by him, like St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Basil the Great, and others like them. Later on, Maximus the Confessor, all of them very influenced by that optimism about the cosmos, an affirmation that the cosmos is indeed good. That's what Genesis, after all, declared. God created the cosmos in how many days? 6, very good. In secular universities, I often teach this, and I ask how many days did God create the world, and people say 7 because they think it's a 7-week day, but he rested, of course, on the 7th day. God created the world in 6 days and declared at the end of that 6-day creation, it's not only good, but very good, very good. The world is very good. And so this is all like manifested and fulfilled in the incarnation. And Eusebius now is elaborating this around the theme of Christian statecraft. So let's now move to another example of early Christian visions of statecraft. And this is the example of the much more influential and in the West famous Augustine of Hippo, who dies in 430. So you can see there's almost a century of difference here between these two figures. Augustine didn't live through this unexpected collapse of pagandom, of pagan statecraft, with the conversion of Constantine. He lived later in the 4th century, and he lived in a different place. He didn't live in the Greek East, which was centered upon the court of Constantine in Constantinople and other cities like Constantinople. Cities like Nicaea, not far from Constantinople, where the first ecumenical council in 325 was hosted by Constantine. Augustine lived in North Africa, which was in the Latin scope of the early church. Now, the early church had a Eastern and Western kind of two halves that would eventually move in very increasingly different directions, and by the convenient date of 1054 would become marked by a division between East and West, between an Orthodox East and a Roman Catholic West. Even though 1054, I always have to kind of concede this. I think 1054 is an important date that we should have in our minds, but it is nevertheless a fact that it took a lot more than just one act of excommunication in that year to effect this schism, this division. Nevertheless, Augustine, living long before that, was already an expression of the differences between East and West, between Greek East and Latin West. So Augustine not only did not have the same historical context as Eusebius, his historical context was one of political disruption and uncertainty, anxiety, because by the late 300s and early 5th century, by the early 5th century, the apparently universal Christian state that Constantine proclaimed was in trouble in the West. And as I'm sure you know, in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire begins to fragment and crumble. In 410, Alaric, a barbarian warlord, sacks Rome for the first time. Rome itself has now fallen to an invasion and sacking by Alaric in 410. Constantine lived through this. It blew his mind, probably in the way that it blew Eusebius's mind, that the emperor of Rome might become Christian. It blew Augustine's mind that Rome could ever fall to some hostile power, but it did in 410. It's a revolutionary kind of experience. Again, one thinks in our own generation, if it is still our generation, I'm not sure it is, it's so long back it seems now, of the collapse of communism in 1991 in the Soviet Union, and even a couple years earlier in Eastern Europe. So Augustine lived through that, and by the time he died in 430, he was already experiencing, and he knew, was getting reports of the barbarians invading North Africa and approaching the city of Hippo, where he was bishop. So his was a time of anxiety, political uncertainty, disorder. But not only that, not only political historical context, but also theological background. For Augustine in North Africa, in the Latin language, and Augustine, he knew a little Greek, but not much. He didn't read Greek really well at all. And so he didn't have access not only to Origen, that he wasn't so important by this point, but by the great Greek fathers of the 4th century. Gregory, the theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, two different Gregories, Basil the Great, Athanasius of Alexandria, all wrote in Greek. And they all had a profound impact on the developing and kind of elaborated Christian cosmology and anthropology of that century. Well, Augustine didn't have much contact with that. He was more influenced by the Western Latin writer Tertullian. Tertullian was a 3rd century, more of a writer than a theologian, but Tertullian was a really, really amazing person. He too was dubious in the sense that he joined a schism during the 3rd century, and so he's not usually regarded as just like Origen is not regarded as a canonized kind of father of the church. He's nevertheless super influential, like Origen was in the East, so Tertullian was in the West. Tertullian had a much more categorical and negative, you might say pessimistic view of the cosmos. Tertullian, of course, was living through a lot of persecution, and that maybe have influenced his thinking of things. I mean, Origen lived through plenty of persecution too, but didn't have a pessimistic view of the cosmos, but Tertullian generally did. Tertullian, to summarize, is famous for his question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? You may have come across that phrase before. It comes from Tertullian, and by it he meant, what does the great Greek pagan tradition of, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and all the great playwrights and so forth, all that great pagan culture have to do with Christianity, Jerusalem? What does it have to do? We Christians should separate ourselves, keep our distance from all that stuff. Not so at all. That Eastern tradition, which was embracing those things and applying them. We already talked about the influence of Plato and Origen, but Tertullian was much more like, you might say, puritanical maybe, in saying we need to keep everything absolutely clear and pure and categorically separated from the surrounding cosmos or world, we Christians. Well, Augustine kind of absorbed some of this dualistic influence from Tertullian, this dualism between the world, the cosmos, and the kingdom of heaven. If in the East there was a tendency to see these as joined together, with, of course, priority and influence coming from heaven, not from the earth itself, untransformed earth, but the transformed earth being the recipient of heavenly influence or transformation. If that was the case in the East, in the West, that incarnational cosmology, you might call it, was not nearly so strong. It wasn't absent, but wasn't nearly so strong in the tradition of Tertullian. And Augustine picks this up, and in the context I just described, where he sees disasters taking place all around him, political, military disasters taking place, it was a convenient way of thinking about the Christian living in this cosmos, in this world. And so Augustine's cosmology then becomes distinct from Eusebius's, and the Augustinian vision of Christian statecraft becomes quite distinct from that of Eusebius. And let me quote to you now a couple passages that are relevant for our discussion this morning from St. Augustine. And by the way, Augustine is a canonized saint in both East and West. He has had almost no impact on the theology of the Christian East, of the Orthodox Church. Unlike in the West, the Roman Catholic Church, he was, the great titan of theology for so long until the rise of scholasticism. But in the East, he was just not even known. If I'm not mistaken, the first theologian father in the East, a Greek father that is, to quote or to refer to Augustine is not until the 9th century. The 9th century was Photios of Constantinople who referred to Augustine, I think, for the first time. And so this is a really striking thing about just the lack of influence he had in the Greek East, where a variety of theologians, I've mentioned some of the names already, were all of them contributing to the kind of clarification or elaboration of Christian theology and anthropology and cosmology. In the West, he was center stage at all times until probably the 11th century. So Augustine kind of held center stage in the theology and cosmology of the West. So let me quote just two passages here from his famous book, The City of God. I'm sure some of you have already read this book, maybe read it several times, read excerpts from it. I'm going to read just a couple. There's so much to be said, so much wisdom, so much insight. This is his magnum opus. This is the greatest work he ever wrote. And he wrote it at the end of his life when he was witnessing the political disintegration of the Western Empire. But notice now a distinction between what I just quoted to you from Eusebius and his Eastern vision of Christian statecraft. Augustine will not be talking in these passages about statecraft as such. He's not writing an oration to any particular emperor or ruler, of course. He's talking about a much more broad theology in the city of God. But the theology is dualistic in a very heightened way compared to the Eastern vision that I've quoted to you from Eusebius here. It emphasizes less the union of heaven and earth and emphasizes rather the division, emphasizes rather the distinctions between the two. And the experience of the Christian living in this life is indeed shaped by the hope of heavenly salvation and joy in eternity. But in the meantime, even here, that phrase that Eusebius uses, even here on earth in this life, even here, while some of that is still there, it is much more subdued. The joy and affirmation of the cosmos, much more subdued. So here's one passage from Augustine from book 19 of the city of God. We see then, Augustine writes, that the supreme good of the city of God is everlasting and perfect peace, which is not the peace through which men pass in their mortality, even here, in their journey from birth to death, but that peace in which they remain in their immortal state, experiencing no adversity at all. In view of this, can anyone deny that this is the supremely blessed life? That is to say, the future life, not the life even here. Or that the present life on earth, however full it may be of the greatest possible blessings of soul and body and of external circumstances, is, in comparison, most miserable. For all that, if anyone accepts the present life in such a spirit that he uses it with the end in view of that other life, the future eternal life, on which he has set his heart with all his ardor and for which he hopes with all his confidence, such a man may without absurdity be called happy even now, even here. There's the phrase. Though, and this is the final point he makes in this statement, though rather by future hope than in present reality. By future hope rather than present reality. That joy, that experience of transformation is something that has to be fulfilled, he emphasizes, only in the future. And now the cosmos, while accepting heavenly influence because of the incarnation, nevertheless is a place where misery reigns. That's the emphasis. Again, we're not talking about radical differences here. We're talking about distinctions of emphasis. The Eastern, you might call it Eusebian vision of Christian statecraft was one that emphasized the union of heaven and earth and the ability of the state to participate in the consequences of the incarnation by ruling in a way that brought heaven to earth, that participated in or facilitated the heavenly transformation of the world. Augustine, on the other hand, emphasizes that such a transformation is always going to be limited. It's always going to be limited. One final quote from Augustine here. The peace which is our special possession is ours even in this life, even here, a peace with God through faith, and it will be ours forever, a peace with God through open vision. But peace here and now, whether the peace shared by all men or our own special possession, is such that it affords a solace for our wretchedness, rather than the joy of blessedness. Our righteousness itself, too, though genuine, in virtue of the genuine ultimate good to which it is referred, is nevertheless only such as to consist in the forgiveness of sins rather than in the perfection of virtues. That's another point he makes to elaborate this. Even here, even now, Christians, for Augustine, can experience a kind of blessedness, but it's not nearly emphasized or amplified as it is in the Eastern tradition around the experience of Constantine's conversion. So to generalize and reach a conclusion here this morning about these two visions of heavenly transformation, the transformation of the world, in the case of Eusebius and Augustine, to conclude, we see here at an early stage in the history of political thought in the West, in Christendom, and at this point, West and East, as much as I've tried to distinguish two kind of regions of thinking, they are still, of course, joined together in one church. We see that there are distinct understandings or visions of how the state participates in the transformation of the cosmos or world. In the East, a very optimistic and affirmative vision is found in Eusebius, and then it gets perpetuated in subsequent theologians going forward from there, who tend to see the state and all of its blemishes and all of its ugliness. Think of the history of Byzantium. The political history of Byzantium is the history of a lot of nasty, ugly, poking eyes out and palace assassinations and things like this. Even so, as much as the ruler in the East is seen as a failure, as someone not living out those heavenly patterns of life, nevertheless, the state itself is seen as a place where people can find the blessedness of the kingdom of heaven, even now. Whereas with Augustine, with his dualism, the state now becomes objectified by a separate, that's what dualism does, a separate point of view or standard or criterion of judgment, which is reserved for the church and her leadership, and the state now becomes placed underneath the judgment of that authority, and is always considered to be at a great shortcoming in terms of that authority's representation or vision of the kingdom of heaven. And so this introduces into the West a pattern, a dualistic pattern, of seeing the state in a very different way. Now, this might be called realism compared to what might be called the idealism of the East. We might say that Augustine has a realism about the role of original sin, of the brokenness of this world, that no state's ever going to escape. And indeed, he did. And indeed, that was one of the geniuses of Augustinian cosmology that will have such an influence on the development of Western civilization going forward, that this realistic understanding that we should never expect the state to fulfill or to be a perfect fulfillment of the kingdom of heaven, that absolutely is the case. But ironically, it was exactly this, and this is where I want to end it today. Ironically, something to think about anyway, ironically, it was exactly this dualism that opened the way, I think, to a more utopian outcome in the West than you have in the East. If in the East, the union of heaven and earth through the incarnation, found even in the role of the state in the cosmos, accepted and celebrated optimistically, affirmatively, the state, nevertheless, there was not a sense that this was the final fulfillment of Christian statecraft. Whereas in Augustine's legacy, you get this dualistic distinction between the state and the kingdom of heaven, the world and the kingdom of heaven, which over time, it'll take centuries to play out, would result in, realistic though it may be, result in the rise of a very idealistic thinking about the state, one which in the secularization that follows the Renaissance, Thomas More, as we were reminded yesterday by Professor Deneen, Thomas More is the one who coins the term utopia in the early 16th century Renaissance. As a result of the secularization of statecraft and political thinking that begins in the Renaissance, takes off in the Enlightenment, and then crashes in the 19th and 20th centuries with those utopias we've also referred to, that comes out of this loss of confidence that the Christian state is a place of heavenly transformation, a place rather in the West that always is subject to criticism and as a result, the idealism of the alternative of idealistic alternatives, secular and even anti-Christian, that we live with in the 21st century today, and look back in the 20th century to as being some of the worst that ever existed. And so these two visions of Christian statecraft, East and West, both of them centered upon what can be considered this transformational imperative of Christianity from the beginning, continue to be relevant for our thinking about where the West is today and what the West once was. Thank you.
Was nice.